Well, thank you, Madam President, and thank you also to Special Coordinator Mladenov for your briefing and for the work you and your team do in difficult circumstances. And may I also thank Ms. Reimer for her briefing and the perspective that she shared, which I think was of great interest. Madam President, 3 years since the adoption of Resolution 2334 by this Council, the United Kingdom notes with concern the Secretary-General's assessment that the situation on the ground since then has only deteriorated. In light of the continued increase in Israeli settlements, we reiterate that settlements are illegal under international law, present an obstacle to peace, and threaten the physical viability of a two-state solution. The United Kingdom notes the Israeli Defense Minister's instructions to act for the advancement of a new Jewish neighborhood in Hebron. We understand that this does not signal the start of a formal planning process. However, if such plans were to advance, this would be of grave concern, given the sensitivities of the location. Demolitions of Palestinian-owned homes and structures have also increased, and the United Kingdom is concerned in particular by the targeting of donor-funded structures in Area C, which are provided on humanitarian grounds to support vulnerable communities. As we have made clear before, any suggestion that parts of the occupied Palestinian territories should be annexed is contrary to international law, damaging to peace efforts, and could not pass unchallenged. Madam President, as the United Kingdom made clear last month, following the escalation of hostilities in Gaza, the indiscriminate attacks against Israeli civilians by Palestinian Islamic Jihad were completely unacceptable. All countries, including Israel, have a legitimate right to self-defense and the right to defend their citizens from attack. In doing so, it is vital that all actions are proportionate, in line with international humanitarian law, and are calibrated to avoid civilian casualties. It is critical that the Palestinian leadership continue their efforts to tackle terror and incitement. Israeli security forces must also avoid the use of excessive force, and we encourage Israel to properly investigate all potential breaches of law, holding those responsible to account. The United Kingdom is concerned to hear of a further increase in the number of attacks by settlers on Palestinians. As the occupying power, Israel has a responsibility to protect the Palestinian population. We urge Israel to thoroughly investigate every instance and bring those responsible to justice. Madam President, turning to positive steps, the United Kingdom welcomes the progress made on implementation of the AHLC-endorsed package of interventions for Gaza, but we do remain concerned by the dire humanitarian situation. We call again on Israel to ease restrictions on water, electricity, and movement and access, which impact the livelihoods and life prospects of ordinary Palestinians in Gaza and breed resentment. We welcome the renewal of UNRWA's mandate and encourage partners to step up with more funding and more predictable disbursements, as the United Kingdom has done. And we welcome continued work towards genuine and democratic national elections for all Palestinians, which is crucial to the establishment of a viable and sovereign Palestinian state. Finally, Madam President, at this highly sensitive time in the region, we call on the parties to show real leadership, including the willingness to make tough compromises, in order to achieve a secure Israel, standing alongside a sovereign Palestinian state. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the report to the representative of Poland.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, let me thank Special Coordinator Mr. Nikolai Mladenov for his briefing. Let me also thank Ms. Adele Remer for her input. Madam President, regrettably, as we have just heard from Special Coordinator, the situation on the ground continues to deteriorate. The reporting period was characterized by acts of violence, including the firing of rockets by Palestinian militants from Gaza against civilians in Israel. On the other hand, Israel's use of lethal force against Palestinians. Casualties occur on both sides to the conflict. In 2016, Security Council adopted Resolution 2334, reaffirming its previous resolutions regarding the applicable international law and the parameters of a peaceful solution to the Middle East peace process. The only way forward for the Palestinians and Israelis is the negotiation of a two-state solution with the State of Israel as an independent and democratic, as well as viable Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, living side by side in peace and security, with border negotiated on the basis of the 1967 lines. Poland's position on Israeli settlements policy is clear and remains unchanged. It is also the European Union's position. All settlement activities illegal under international law. The Israeli illegal settlements erode the viability of the two-state solution and the prospect for a lasting peace. We also reiterate our concern about the calls for a possible annexation of areas in the West Bank. Such a move would constitute a serious breach of international law and would also be deeply damaging to peace efforts. Poland would like to echo the concern with regards to demolitions and seizures of donors-funded humanitarian projects. Madam President, let me now turn to the situation in Gaza, which remains dire. We call on all to take urgent steps leading to a fundamental change in the humanitarian, political, security, and economic situation in Gaza, although through an end to the closure policy and sustained opening of the crossing points important for Gazans' daily life. While doing so, at the same time, we need to address Israel's legitimate security concerns. On the political track, we have to acknowledge that the process is currently almost entirely blocked. The inter-Palestinian division only aggravates the situation of the people of Gaza and weakens the national aspirations of the Palestinians. Poland welcomes ongoing discussions on the holding of Palestinian general elections, first Palestinian elections since 2006. They must be organized across the OPT and on a border intra-Palestinian agreement must be reached on the modalities of holding elections. It is critical that the important Egyptian-led intra-Palestinian reconciliation efforts continue. We remain gravely concerned about the continuing violence, terrorist attacks against civilians, and incitement to violence that greatly exacerbate mistrust between Israelis and Palestinians and are incompatible with a peaceful resolution. There is no justification for terrorism. The indiscriminate rocket and mortar attacks against the Israeli civilian population are totally unacceptable and must stop. Such attacks are prohibited by international humanitarian law, and Palestinian militias must cease the practice immediately. The security situation in Gaza remains very fragile, with 3 serious military escalations in 2019. The killing of the 9 members of a family in an Israeli airstrike whose home was mistakenly targeted must be investigated. The situation continues to be at risk of a major escalation at the immense suffering of the people, and the immense suffering of the people continues. Let me stress that Israeli security forces must fully comply with the principle of necessity and proportionality while using the force. On the other hand, the relevant authorities and the organizers of protests in Gaza must ensure that protests remain peaceful. Furthermore, both sides have a legal and moral obligation to fully protect the rights of children and prevent violations and abuses of their rights. Neither Palestinian nor Israeli children must suffer the consequences of this conflict. Madam President, allow me to conclude with UNRWA, which remains a key contributor to the stability and security of the region. In this context, Poland welcomes the last week's renewal of UNRWA's mandate by the General Assembly. We will continue to support the agency in its effort to provide necessary services and assistance for the Palestinian refugees. Thank you.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, I would like to first of all thank Mr. Mladenov for his statement and thank Ms. Reimer for his testimony. I'd like to also thank the Secretary General for his report on the implementation of Resolution 2334. 3 years after the adoption of this resolution, we in France regret that it's not implemented. The report of the Secretary General is unequivocal. It shows that there is an unprecedented intensification of the settlement policy, with decisions on 22,000 housing units at various stages of the approval process and 8,000 other units being tendered for, and this has happened since the Resolution 2334 was adopted in December 2016. We call for the Israeli policy of a settlement in the occupied Palestinian territories. We recall that this is contrary to international law. We are very concerned by the continued settlement policy in those areas which can undermine the territorial continuity of the future Palestinian state, in particular in Gilo. We're worried by the announcements made as regards the construction of new housing units in particularly sensitive areas, such as, for example, in the North Zion in East Jerusalem or the Old Market in Hebron. And we deplore the infrastructure projects which are aimed at integrating the infrastructure between the settlements in the Jerusalem area and the ones in the center of Israel. On the other hand, the destruction and seizure of Palestinian property is also on the increase this year in East Jerusalem and Area C. We note with concern the destruction of 26 infrastructure projects funded by the international community, in particular by the European Union countries, and this is in the past 3 months. And finally, the repeated announcements by Israeli authorities about the annexation of settlements or whole swathes in West Bank are a source of major concern for us. If these were to be implemented, they will constitute a serious violation of international law. We therefore call upon the Israeli authorities to abandon any and all project which could result in fait accompli contrary to the solution of 2 states. We will follow the developing situation very closely, and we stand ready to react together with our European partners. The situation in Gaza also remains fragile. We have unequivocally condemned the rocket fire from Gaza towards Israeli inhabited areas. And this is in violation of international law. And we recall our unfailing commitment to Israeli security. We also recall the right of Israelis and Palestinians to live in peace, dignity, and security, and we'll lament the civilian victims on both sides. What is needed now is to make sure that the ceasefire arrived at on the 14th of November, thanks to the efforts made by Egypt and Special Coordinator, that this ceasefire be fully abided by. Above and beyond the need to abide by the ceasefire, I have to say that there will be no stability in Gaza without lifting the blockade whilst providing credible security guarantees for Israel, nor will this be possible without the return of the Palestinian Authority within the framework of inter-Palestinian reconciliation. Holding credible Palestinian elections in the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem will be a key step towards inter-Palestinian reconciliation, and so is to strengthen the Palestinian institutions which came out of the Oslo Accords. In this context, I call upon the Palestinian authorities to continue their efforts here, and I also remind them that we stand ready to support them in this regard. Finally, I'd like to recall that there is no alternative to a negotiating agreement amongst parties on the basis of internationally agreed parameters. Only a 2-state solution with Jerusalem as capital of these both states will enable us to meet the aspirations of Israelis and Palestinians, enabling them to live side by side in peace and security, and also bring lasting peace to the region. any solution that would move us away from the parameters agreed by the international community will necessarily be doomed to failure. There is no status quo that we're witnessing in the field. What we're witnessing is a deterioration of the situation, and this is untenable because it's in the interest of neither one of the parties. This heightens tensions, undermines the two-state solutions, and moves further away the prospect of a lasting peace. And this can only breed despair and the temptation to succumb to extremism. The UNRWA mandate will remain key for as long as lasting peace, providing a just, realistic, and lasting solution to the refugees issue is not found. We therefore welcome the renewal of the mandate of the agency for 3 years, and we call for an increase in international mobilization so as to cover the financial gap by the end of the year. And we, for our part, have doubled our contribution to UNRWA this year. 3 years after the Resolution 2334 was adopted, it is high time to implement it. What's at stake here is the credibility of this Council and the credibility of us all. In this regard, the Secretary General's report mentions the decision issued by the European Union Court of Justice on the 12th November 2019 on the obligation to label goods from the occupied Palestinian territories and Israeli settlements. This is in line with the requirements in Resolution 2334, which speaks about the need for a differentiation policy. We will continue being mobilized so as to implement Resolution 2334. I thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. And at the outset, let me thank Special Coordinator Mladenov for his report and thank Mrs. Raymer for her remarks. Mr. President, 3 years have passed since the adoption of Resolution 2334, but as the Secretary General has noted in his latest report, the situation on the ground has continuously deteriorated since then. We thank the Secretary General for his balanced report. We are greatly concerned by his observations with regard to the implementation of Resolution 2334 and the current status of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Germany remains firmly committed to a negotiated two-state solution based on the internationally agreed parameters. We continue to believe that the two-state solution is the only viable solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that meets Israeli and Palestinian security needs, fulfills Palestinian aspirations for statehood and sovereignty, ends the occupation that began in 1967, resolves all permanent status issues, and guarantees equal rights for all inhabitants. We support any efforts which aim at reviving the political process as long as it is in line with international law, ensures equal rights, and is acceptable to both parties, Israelis and Palestinians. Unilateral actions or creating facts on the ground will, however, neither help reaching a just and lasting solution nor lead to sustainable peace. We therefore call on all the parties to the conflict, but also on all international stakeholders, to refrain from taking any measures which risk undermining the viability of a negotiated two-state solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict on the basis of the internationally agreed parameters. Madam President, one of the main obstacles to a political settlement of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains the ongoing Israeli occupation and the continued settlement activities in the territories occupied since 1967. We reiterate our position that Israeli settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territories are illegal under international law and undermine the prospects for ending the occupation and achieving a negotiated two-state solution. 2019 marks a record year in the expansion of Israeli settlement activity and the legalization of settlement outposts since the adoption of Resolution 2334. This is a matter of serious concern to us. We also remain gravely concerned about an increased number of demolitions and seizures of Palestinian-owned structures across the West Bank, including donor-financed humanitarian projects and evictions of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem. As noted by the Secretary General in his report, these demolitions also affected 26 structures financed by international donors. We therefore call upon Israel to end the expansion of settlements, the legalization of settlement outposts, the confiscation of Palestinian land, and evictions from and the demolition and seizure of Palestinian-owned structures. And we remain extremely concerned about repeated statements alluding to or even announcing an intended annexation of the Jordan Valley and other parts of the occupied West Bank. Should such statements turn into actual government policy or law, this would constitute a clear violation of international law. We strongly advise any Israeli government against taking any steps in this direction, as this would have serious negative repercussions on the viability of the two-state solution and the entire peace process. We also reiterate that Germany will continue to distinguish between the territory of the State of Israel and the territories occupied since 1967, and that we will not recognize any changes to the 4th of June 1967 lines, including with regard to Jerusalem, other than those agreed by the parties. Madam President, Resolution 2334 needs to be fully implemented, not only with regard to settlement activities, but also with regard to acts of terror, violence against civilians, incitement, provocative actions, and inflammatory rhetoric. We welcome that the report of the Secretary General also focuses on these obstacles to achieving peace and share his grave concerns about the continuing violence, terrorist attacks against civilians, incitement, and provocative rhetoric and actions. Germany condemns all attacks on Israel in the strongest possible terms, including the repeated firing of rockets from Gaza into Israel. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad must stop firing rockets into Israel. There is no justification for the firing of rockets into Israel or any other form of terrorism. We remain steadfast in our commitment to Israel's security and stress Israel's right to self-defense and its right to react adequately and proportionally to attacks against its territory. Incidents with innocent civilian victims must, however, be thoroughly investigated, and accountability for violations of international law must be ensured. Madam President, a word on the situation in Gaza. The 3 serious military escalations in 2019 in and around Gaza are deeply concerning and highlight the urgent need for a sustainable long-term solution to the ongoing humanitarian and economic crisis in Gaza. We call upon both Israel and the Palestinian Authority to do their respective part in order to improve the situation in Gaza. In this context, we welcome the ongoing intra-Palestinian discussions on the holding of legislative and presidential elections in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and Gaza, as this could give renewed democratic legitimacy and strengthen national unity. Madam President, before concluding, let me also say a word on UNRWA. Germany welcomes the renewal of UNRWA's mandate for 3 years, as UNRWA continues to contribute to the stability in the region by providing humanitarian assistance, health services, and education. As the largest bilateral donor, Germany remains firmly committed to UNRWA and continues to significantly contribute to UNRWA's budget. Against the background of the critical financial situation of UNRWA, we encourage other donors to similarly continue their financial support to the agency by disbursing the funds they have pledged. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Germany for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to first of all thank the Special Coordinator, Mr. Mladenov, and Ms. Reimer. I thank them for their statements. We welcome the practice of having 2 written reports per year. The date of the 26th of December is the 3rd anniversary of the adoption of Resolution 2334, and we have no reason to be optimistic. The situation on the ground is stuck, and it shows that the solution is farther away than ever. Unfortunately, we have to state that the negative developments on the ground are hand in hand with the questioning the basic fundamental principles on which the resolution of this conflict is based. One of such basic fundamental legal principles is the illegal nature of the settlement policy. The position of Belgium, and more broadly speaking, the European position here, is clear. Settlements are a flagrant violation of international law, including Resolution 2334, and it takes us further away from the 2-state solutions. But what we're witnessing here is that ever since the adoption of 2334, the settlement policy has continued at a fast pace in West Bank. It is also aims at particularly symbolic areas, such as, for example, the old city of Hebron or East Jerusalem. The settlement policy is also accompanied by such measures as demolitions and evictions. They are on a sharp increase because the figures in 2019 exceeds the total number of demolitions and seizures in the course of the 2 previous years. We call on Israel to put an end to this policy. And in this context, we also underscore the importance of preserving the status quo of the sacred places in Jerusalem. We reiterate our very serious concern given the statements on the possible unilateral annexation of all or part of the West Bank. Annexation is illegal under international law and it will not be recognized by Belgium. Finally, we reiterate our deep concern related to the worrying growing of demolitions and seizures of humanitarian projects in Area C, and we urge the Israeli authorities to end this and to either restitute or compensate for the damages incurred. Madam President, the security situation in Gaza is extremely fragile. We recall the imperative need for both parties to respect the rules of international humanitarian law and human rights. We call on both parties to exercise the greatest possible restraint in order to avoid new episodes of violence. In-depth investigations have to be conducted where there are allegations of violations of international humanitarian law. We reiterate the importance of respecting the right to peacefully protest and the responsibility for organizers to ensure the peaceful nature of such protests. There is no lasting solution in Gaza without the return of Palestinian authorities. And here, we would like to reiterate our appeal for the Palestinians to continue with the reconciliation process in good faith. And we call upon the Palestinian authorities to promote strong, inclusive, responsible, democratic institutions based on the respect of the rule of law and human rights. It is important for the elections to take place throughout the Palestinian territory in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, as well as in the Gaza Strip. We call upon all of the parties, Israel included, to facilitate this process. Madam President, we remain convinced that there is no alternative to a negotiated solution based on the coexistence of the states with the city of Jerusalem as capital of both states in line with internationally agreed parameters, and Belgium will continue working towards that so as to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinians and Israelis. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Belgium for her statement. I give the floor to